Welcome to Voices for Peace and Conservation. Join us in listening to inspiring stories from people who are working to save nature while also promoting peace. From the plains of northern Kenya to international conference rooms in Switzerland. Our guests will help us answer the question, how do we take care of nature and live in peace? My name is Hester Grunewald, and I have worked on peace and conflict issues for many years. I will be your host for this podcast on behalf of 4 organizations who work on conservation and peace. They are Conservation International, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, PeaceNexus Foundation, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature, Germany. Our collective experience has convinced us that we need to work together much more closely as peacebuilding and conservation practitioners. Whether we are researchers, policymakers, or activists, we all have a part to play. But how do we do this? And what lessons can we learn from each other's work? Over the course of the coming episodes, we'll be exploring these questions with our guests. For more information, have a look at the podcast description notes. Voices for Peace and Conservation is produced by Impact with Joy. And now, enjoy the podcast. In today's episode, we'll take a closer look at a high-priority policy and research topic, the links between climate change and conflict. It is widely accepted that climate change acts as a threat multiplier that could fuel instability and conflict around the world, with particularly devastating effects for the most vulnerable people. At a policy level, these links are largely understood, and practically, climate adaptation programming has been promoted as an effective response. But given the seriousness of climate fragility impacts, narrowly focused adaptation and mitigation efforts are not enough. Instead, we need to also respond to the specific ways in which climate and conflict challenges fuel each other in each context. Climate solutions are much more likely to be sustainable if programs to address climate challenges also make people safer and contribute to peaceful coexistence. We will discuss these questions today with 2 guests. One who brings a research and the other a practical programming perspective. Giacomo Fedele is the Climate Adaptation Manager at Conservation International. His research focuses on nature-based transformative adaptation. He has been supporting CI's country teams to implement and monitor climate change adaptation programs with vulnerable communities. Our second guest is Lydia Cardona. She is the Conflict Resolution and Peace Manager at Conservation International, focusing on the organization's environmental peacebuilding program. Lydia supports conservation colleagues around the world to be conflict sensitive in their work. This includes making sure that their projects do not fuel or worsen conflict, but also that they help promote peace wherever possible. Great to have you both with us, Giacomo and Lydia.
Thanks for having us. Excited to talk about this today.
Thanks, Hester. Yeah, very happy to be here with you.
Let me start with you, Giacomo. Your work is focused on transformative adaptation and nature-based solutions to climate change. That's quite a mouthful. What does this mean, and how does social resilience come into your work?
Yes, transformative adaptation is really about addressing the root causes of climate vulnerability and the impact in a proactive way. So climate change, we know, is already happening, and we need to adjust the way we behave. Think about, for example, of a coastal area that is experiencing increasingly severe floods, for example, due to climate change. So to respond, this community that is affected by floods might borrow money to repair their homes or increase their houses' height. So these are examples of coping strategies or incremental adaptation to climate change. But these measures might not be enough to help the community to reduce the risk of floods in the long term, in the future. So when you implement a transformative adaptation instead, you really focus on those fundamental changes that alter the social and ecological interaction for the purpose of reducing the vulnerability to climate change, but really in a long term. And so for this flood-prone community, this might mean to relocate their houses in safer areas, farther away from the coast or at higher level on the top of a hill. Or another option for them that is transformative as well is to restore the degraded wetlands that can help the water to be regulated and help the water flows so they are protected.
Right. That's very interesting to get a better sense of what that means. And so for Lydia, you work closely with conservation practitioners on integrating conflict sensitivity into their work. Why is this important to conservation efforts, and how does this connect back to climate change?
Yeah, so conflict sensitivity is important to conservation because quite often conservation work happens in fragile contexts. And if we aren't careful about how we approach our work, we can inadvertently deepen divisions or fuel conflicts over natural resources that are already present in the communities where we're working. And I think that this makes conflict sensitivity incredibly important in the context of our climate work because conservation right now is placing big bets on nature-based solutions. And what does that mean? Right? Our work is focused on protecting and restoring nature to harness its potential for capturing greenhouse gases and helping us adapt. But in order to do this, to protect forests, restore lands, improve their management, you have to work effectively with people and respond to their needs and those vulnerabilities that Giacomo was referring to. All of this implies working with those people who rely on forests for their livelihoods and other needs. It means building trust with those communities and responding to conflict proactively in their work, responding to those vulnerabilities, because these are the issues that in the long run could undermine our efforts. So, it's great if we're successful now, but if it's not sustainable 5 or 10 years from now, then we've ultimately failed. And I think that in particular, when it comes to climate adaptation, which is already centered on responding to these human needs, there's a really great opportunity to integrate solutions from peacebuilding and development to achieve mutual goals.
Yeah, no, I think what Lydia is saying is super important. Our research and experiences on the ground are showing that we need to incorporate this forward-looking thinking and this long-term thinking into nature conservation projects or in the land use management more generally. So nature can really help us to meet several of our needs, like our livelihoods, the water that we drink, the food that we eat. But nature is also being severely affected by the impact of climate change. So when nature is degraded, it cannot contribute to our well-being anymore. For example, this is the case of forest fires or cyclones that are directly damaging the nature. But nature can also be impacted indirectly by the effect of climate change. And this is happening, for example, when people use nature as part of their coping or their adaptation strategies in unsustainable ways. So these people might, for example, cutting down trees from the forest to rebuild their houses or to gain new land for their cultivation, for their rice or for vegetables. And another example of an adaptation strategy that might degrade nature is one that is involving competition with scarce natural resources that are, exacerbated by the effect of climate change. And these people might also be forced to migrate, abandon their land, and so stop managing those land sustainably.
So that really fuels the cycle further between conflict and climate change impacts and the disruption that the degradation of these resources can cause. And I wonder, Lydia, do you have any practical examples from your fieldwork of how conflict sensitivity is integrated in a climate-focused program?
Yeah, so one particular team I've worked a lot with is working in a protected area where the government historically set the forest aside for protection, but hadn't consulted with the communities that were living there. And it's a region with historically high rates of deforestation. People rely on the land for their livelihoods, and that drives deforestation because of a lack of better options. So In this region, there's conflict over ownership and rights of the land from different groups of people. And with there being conflict and these competing interests related to security and government intervention, it can be a dangerous context at times for staff, for law enforcement, and even the communities living there. And so it's precisely in this type of context that we're placing these big bets on protecting or restoring forests like these as a way to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, right? So from a climate perspective, it's really important. And I think people often think that the best way of approaching this is through enforcement, but this can be a really reactionary response. You have to get to the underlying issues as well, in the same way that Giacomo's work in transformative adaptation tries to respond to those vulnerabilities. And conflict is a part of that as well. So one example is that we've helped create a livelihoods program that gives people incentives to move away from deforestation to other livelihood options. And one of the men involved in this program, who was there from the beginning, he was originally pretty much a poster child for that work. And he eventually left the program to join a group that seeks to intimidate those working with the government in the protected area. And so the lesson is that you can't just rely on enforcing existing laws or responding to livelihoods alone, because in many places like this, rule of law can be weak, or the government may not be able to be in control of what happens in that area. So we need solutions that respond to conflict and human needs as well. And this is where conflict sensitivity and peacebuilding approaches can be really important in climate work, because there's really great research out there that supports this idea of integrating peacebuilding and climate adaptation, and that there are synergies and co-benefits that produce better outcomes for both when they're done together.
Really interesting. And Lydia, have you also seen examples where people have deliberately done peace building work as part of their conservation work in areas like the ones you've just described?
Yeah, I have. And it's very much in that same context that I was just describing. So the park guards who work there, they probably wouldn't call it that, but some of the work that they're doing, that protected area, I think is very much linked to peace building approaches, right? So they go out for 30 to 40 days at a time into the forest and remote areas without weapons, and their mandate is to enforce the rules of the protected area. And so how do they do that, right? They've learned to befriend and gain the trust of the communities who may not see their authority as legitimate because it's a necessity. So one of my favorite stories is of a park guard who shared with me that in one of his trips where he went out for several weeks at a time, and he encountered a really remote area again. And there were people there who showed up, and they weren't receptive to government presence there. And they had machetes in hand and were ready to, confront and kind of try to drive him out. And as soon as they saw him, they were like, aren't you the guy who plays soccer with us or with that other group on Saturdays? And so it ended up being like this really, unexpected, fun invitation for him to join them. And they do that, right? They break bread with these communities. They play sports. They do things like that are focused on building trust and respect and community with them. And in another instance, one of our staff members, I recall, describing that for the Sustainable Livelihoods program that we have there, they had to go and visit one particular person 60 times in order to build his trust and convince him to become part of that program. And they did. They were able to do that over time with that persistence and with that, community building approach. And so that goes back to the point that I mentioned, where enforcement isn't enough, right? You do have to really engage people and respond to their needs and build community with them, help build consensus. And so all of this is done intuitively and has led to great outcomes so far in this particular area. And I think that if conservation as a whole approaches our climate adaptation work in this way, that more intentionally and explicitly builds in peace building and conflict sensitivity approaches, then our outcomes can be so much better in the long term.
So it's very clear that it works at a practical level. And Giacomo, what does your research tell you about how conflict and peace-focused work could help make climate change adaptation efforts more successful as well?
Yes, well, when it comes to the climate crisis and peace, we really understand that there is a sense of urgency and the need to address inequalities. And for example, the communities and countries who contributed the least in producing carbon emission are those that are facing the most negative consequence of an unstable climate. And these are, for example, dry areas in sub-Saharan Africa that are affected by longer dry season. Or I'm thinking about, the small island states in the Pacific whose coasts are prone to sea level rise. So there should be a sense of urgency towards doing this work right, which not only should support effort to reduce carbon emission, which are very important, but they should also really try to address the inequalities and try to maintain peace as well. So I think when we integrate both conservation and peace building together, we then mutually guarantee that we have long-term success of our work. But on the other hand, if we neglect to respond to these links, we risk to undermine our own success, our own work, especially in fragile context. And for an agenda like climate change adaptation, which really depends upon the long-term success of those interventions to effectively reduce vulnerability, is very important. I think one of the best ways to do so is to take into consideration the current, but also the expected social impact of climate change, and really anticipate those consequences and integrate action to respond to those consequences in our project design and in our plans. I think another important element that climate change adaptation can learn from the work on conflict sensitivity is how to avoid the exclusion of the most marginalized and the most vulnerable groups when we implement the adaptation intervention. Here, for example, adaptation measured might support new agricultural practices. But when we are providing those benefits to farmers, those farmers, they have to have the access to the land. So in that case, when we are implementing this kind of adaptation strategies, we might forget that there are other beneficiaries that are very vulnerable and are those without the land. So to overcome those issues, it's really important to gain a broader understanding of the local context, of the local vulnerability, and recognize that adaptation is not only a technical process, but it's also a political process. So we have to take into account the different power dynamics and the different potential conflicts that can be involved. So in this case, we really need to ensure that the most marginalized group are effectively participating in the project design when we are developing the adaptation strategies. So they should be active participant in co-designing those adaptation interventions. And this could be a possible solution to avoid what I said before. So only by working together, I think, merging the best practices between climate change adaptation and conflict sensitivity and really taking into account the local context, then we can have effective adaptation on the ground, especially that is especially effective for those people that need it the most.
That's really powerful. And it really seems there's a strong case and some practical program examples that show why it matters to connect work on climate conservation and peace. So I'd like to ask both of you a final question, maybe first to Lydia and then to Giacomo. From your respective areas of work, why is it so rare to see integrated programs and funding for such work? And what opportunities do you see for this moving forward?
So you're right, Hesta, there are some really great examples, and Giacomo's response was really powerful and showing some of that importance there. And I think that generally there's a recognition that the challenges we are confronting from a conservation perspective, from a conflict perspective, there's a systems link across these. And yet the solutions are so often approached from just one sector. So if we're, a conservation organization, we're responding to those environmental challenges. And so I've been trying to understand what those entry points are. And I think what I've seen is that it's a slow progression. There's recognition, but it's slow, right? And I think part of it is that people feel overloaded. I sometimes hear that, responding to conflict or peace building that into our work, that's outside of our mandate, that it's another agenda. People working in these challenging contexts often have so many other competing demands on their time as it is, and limited funding. So these are some of the things that I'm hearing. And I recognize that it's not just a conservation issue either. This is very much the case in other sectors as well. Peace building, development, conservation actors will often work in the same exact context and not work together. So despite that, I would say that there is an interest, and I've seen that from our staff, and I've seen how they are building in approaches that are really transversal, even responding to gender-based violence, for example, in their work. But what I think we need to really take advantage of that interest that's already there, those approaches that people are starting to build on, is more incentives from the top down. So incentives from governments and from donors to really integrate approaches from other sectors and to work together. And that's when I think that we'll really see some of these entry points for integrated approaches and climate work in particular start to pick up, because the evidence is there. There's already interest from organizations, from individuals doing work on the ground to do it. So I think that final missing piece is really that top-down kind of drive to really do this.
I agree, Lydia. Climate change adaptation already has such a strong component focused on responding to human needs and community vulnerability. So there are many existing synergies there. So these synergies are particularly important, I think, when we use nature to help us to adapt to climate change. And this kind of nature-based solutions are becoming increasingly popular and important. And this nature-based solution for adaptation involve the protection, the sustainability of natural resources, and the restoration of nature. And they can really reduce the impact of climate change for people. But one of those contributions that nature can provide to us, to people, it's about human health and human security. However, I think we don't have much robust empirical evidence because of the challenges that we are facing in measuring the positive contribution that this solution have for humans. So that's definitely an area that would really benefit from collaboration between the environmental sector, the peace building, and the conservation initiatives. I still think that silos exist, however, and but we're very used to this in our adaptation work, because we usually work across sectors, and we always need to involve multiple actors at different levels. And we know that this can be really challenging sometimes, especially when there are so many different interests on the land, and when the tenure is not clear, which in the places where we work is often the case. And that's also normal when you work on shared natural resources, whether these are communal grasslands, oceans, or community forests. And it's not always easy to bring all these different diverse people to talk together, especially when they have competing interests, different values, and also different power. And so when you bring them together at the same table, you have to be careful and give space to everybody to really provide their perspective when they help us to develop or co-develop those adaptation solutions. But, because climate change and security risks are usually topics that are of shared concern with the communities that we work, these barriers, I think, can be overcome, and there can be actually more synergies. I think that empirical studies and practical example that we are gaining with different projects on the ground can really help us to build the confidence that these kind of approaches, integrated approaches, really work.
Giacomo and Lydia, thank you so much for your insights. And there's clearly some very important challenges, but also some really clear opportunities where this integrated work can happen much better on the ground. And I think what I'm taking from this as well is that not only is the case clear that we should be integrating climate adaptation and peacebuilding work more closely, but also that whenever we are doing it, the effects are positive. We are achieving more and we are more successful and effective. So thank you both for your time and all the best with your continuing work on these issues. This episode's content was provided by Conservation International, a global conservation organization working in 30 countries around the world to protect nature and biodiversity. Their vision is a healthy, prosperous world in which societies are committed to caring for and valuing nature for the long-term benefit of people and all life on Earth. To do this, CI proactively addresses conflict risks that their staff and the communities where they work might face. To find out more about Conservation International's work on conservation and peace, visit their website at conservation.org/peace. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that you will join me in the next one, where our guest is none other than Nobel Peace Prize laureate and former president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos. We'll talk about the importance of environmental issues for peace in Colombia, the role of indigenous people, and opportunities for environmental peacebuilding in the midst of the pandemic. Be sure to sign up or follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any other platform where you usually enjoy your podcasts. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great day and see you next time.